I'm recording. Okay, sorry guys, but anyway, I was recording to avoid any talking in the video. But anyway, greetings, gamers. Agent SN, and what you're seeing here is some more Final Fantasy. Yep, I've been holding off on this video for too long, and I wanted to get it out as early as possible. So here we are, guys. So last night we looked at Final Fantasy 1, 2, 3, and 4. We looked at all three of the NES Final Fantasy games, and the first mainline Final Fantasy on the SNES, Final Fantasy 4. Today we're going to be taking a look at Final Fantasy 5 and 6, the last two on the SNES, and the PlayStation trilogy of 7, 8, and 9. I was going to say 9 for part 3, but I'm saying part 3 for 10, 10 to 11, 12, 13, 32, Lightning Returns, 14, and 15. So here we are. Let's get started with Final Fantasy V. So the version we're seeing here is the PlayStation version, which is Final Fantasy Anthology. Now, the original game was considered too hard for American gamers, similar to Mario Bros. Lost Levels, so it didn't get localized until Final Fantasy Anthology came out, which is probably the best. Well, which isn't the best way to play it, but the best way to have it displayed on a TV. If you want to be able to display it on your TV or something, or want to have a bunch of fun, yeah. Now, if you live in Japan, well, you probably are familiar with the SNES version, but if you live in the US, you're probably unable to obtain it, so you may want to check in the Anthology version. That added a lot of new features and is more accessible to people here. However, it's not the definitive way to play it. Yeah, by the way, guys, though, before getting into the Game Boy Advance version, the Final Fantasy V on the PlayStation added a lot of new things that Final Fantasy 1 and 2 did, and that 4 did on the PlayStation. And, yeah, however, it's not the definitive way to play it. The definitive way to play it is on a handheld, and it is not the mobile or the Steam version. You'll actually see why. I'll talk about the GBA version last. So after many years after this game was re-released on PlayStation, on the GBA, this game also got a remake on mobile and PC, and oh my gosh, do not play it. I mean, it's still Final Fantasy V at the end of the day, and Final Fantasy V is a good game, but the graphics are trash. I mean, look at this. They're like Vaseline smeared sprites, like a lot of fans call them. The graphics are ugly. I mean, who would want to play the game like this? They just feel so washed out. They feel so ugly. I'm not really a fan of the graphics like a lot of people. I mean, if you want to at least be able to just play Final Fantasy V, yeah, sure, but I don't really recommend it if you want a definitive way to play, considering that the graphics are super duper ugly. If we're going to play Final Fantasy V, play the version I'm going to talk about next. Now, this version did have many new features that the GBA and PlayStation versions added. However, the washed out graphics, because the graphics are a bit ugly and they don't feel right, I do not see this as a definitive version. And I don't like the mobile and Steam version of Final Fantasy III, where I consider it the definitive version. I do not share this with Final Fantasy V, nor do I do it the next game. Do not play the mobile or PC version unless you just want to at least have a way to play Final Fantasy V. If you're going to play it, you got to play the GBA version I'm going to talk about. So next we got the Game Boy Advance version. This is the definitive edition. I consider this... Sorry guys, my alarm was going off. But anyway, Final Fantasy V Advance is the definitive way to play this game. It makes the game way better since the original Final Fantasy V on the SNES was very hard. It adds a new dungeon, adds new character classes. It feels so great. And unlike most SNES ports, and unlike most Game Boy Advance ports of SNES games, where they're not as good as the original version because of the graphics, this actually does look better than the SNES version. And I'd say kind of the same for the PlayStation version, but I'd say this is the definitive way to play it, I guess. Play this version. Let's move on to Final Fantasy VI, which follows a similar re-release path. So after Final Fantasy V, and on Final Fantasy V, which didn't get localized, Final Fantasy VI did, and it was called Final Fantasy III in the US, since Square Enix skipped Final Fantasy 2 and 3 and went to 4 to release it in the US. But Final Fantasy VI, now if you guys haven't played Final Fantasy VI yet, you have to. Final Fantasy VI is a masterpiece. It's my second favorite SNES game, and although it's not as good as 9 or 7, from what I can say, although I don't enjoy much as 9 or 7, which you'll see later in this video, Final Fantasy VI is an amazing game. It is my third favorite Final Fantasy. It is such an amazing experience. It is the best of the NES and SNES era of Final Fantasy you guys have been playing. But all that aside, what's the definitive version? Well, the game started out on the SNES. This is probably, I'd say, the best version to play it on. It adds so many new things to the table, to the series. It really revolutionized Final Fantasy until 7 came out, my favorite game of all time, that you're gonna see up next. And all the characters are really good. This is probably the simplest way to play it, I guess, and probably the most accessible way. And this game is also released on the Wii Virtual Console. The only problem, though, is that the Wii shop has shut down. But if you buy an SNES Classic, play it there. It is the most definitive way to play it. But what if you don't have an SNES Classic or a Wii, or if you don't live in Japan and you can't get it on the Wii U or new 3DS Virtual Consoles? Well, we've got you covered, because this game is, although this is probably the definitive way to play it, if you have access to those, the game's also available on. So we got the PlayStation version. This version is also included with Final Fantasy Anthology. However, it's not as good as the SNES version. But if you don't have, but if you didn't buy this on the Wii Virtual Console, or you don't live in Japan, can get on the Wii U or 3DS Virtual Console, and if you don't want to put an SNES Classic, well, the PlayStation version is for you. You can track down an old Final Fantasy Anthology disc, or if you own a PSP, a PS Vita, or a PS3, you can buy it there digitally. And this is also possibly the most accessible way to play it outside of another version I'll be talking about or something. And yeah, it's mostly the same, so not too much. But let's move on to. Alright guys, so now we're on to the Game Boy Advance version. This is also one of the best ways to play it. I mean, well, I guess mixed between the Game Boy Advance and the SNES versions are actually the definitive version. This actually adds a few new summons and stuff, and slightly better graphics, but I say this is still the definitive way to play it outside of the SNES original. Well, both the SNES and the GBA versions are very balanced out, so just choose either. I mean, I prefer the SNES version's graphics alongside, but since I prefer this, both versions are just balanced out. Just play either of them. I mean, play on the SNES or the Game Boy Advance. Choose. 6 is still an amazing game, but I'm not gonna go too depth with it, considering the Game Boy Advance version is mostly the same as Final Fantasy V's Game Boy Advance release. So, yeah. But just like Final Fantasy V, there's a mobile PC version that's terrible and lame I'm gonna be talking about. Yep, like I said, Final Fantasy VI went under a similar release line as Final Fantasy V, as it got released on the PlayStation, then on the Game Boy Advance, it came to Virtual Consoles in Japan, and they got released on PlayStation, of course. But like Final Fantasy V, do not play the mobile version. Yes, it has some of the extra stuff that GBA and PlayStation version introduced, but the graphics are terrible. I hate the graphics. They look so washed out. They look so weird. I mean, and the graphics just don't look right to me, to be honest. I mean, I understand why Square Enix made it like that, If I were to see a full 3D remake just like Final Fantasy 3, yeah, the graphics just aren't really the best. They just aren't for me. Well, and for many fans. Play the PlayStation version, or play the SNES version. Or I guess the GBA version too. The SNES or GBA. And play the GBA version for Final Fantasy V. Or I guess PlayStation version too. But let's move on. Let's move on, guys, because now we're taking a leap from the SNES to the PlayStation. We're switching because after Final Fantasy VI, something big went on. We're flipping generations. We're going from 2D graphics on the SNES to 3D graphic. Yeah, we're going from the Super Nintendo to Sony's PlayStation, where 3D graphics were very popularized, and a game that revolutionized all upcoming RPGs and the Final Fantasy series. So, yep, and next up, we got Final Fantasy VII. So after the SNES, Square Enix was getting ready for a new Final Fantasy game with a new generation. But because they had a hard time getting this game to work on the N64, due to having so much, and because the PlayStation was a lot more powerful and could use CDs instead of cartridges, and CDs were easier and cheaper to produce, Square Enix moved to Sony. I switched from Nintendo to Sony, and we're on PlayStation, and oh boy, is this game better than 6. I mean, Final Fantasy 6 was an amazing game, but Final Fantasy 7 takes it to the next level. Like I said before, this is my Final Fantasy game. This is my favorite Final Fantasy. Not only is it my favorite Final Fantasy, but my favorite video game ever made, period. I mean, this game feels so special to me because I love its world and its protagonists a ton. I mean, I love its world more than any other video game out there. And although Mario will always be my favorite video game character, or Luigi, Cloud, I so much love for too. I love its world, I love its characters, I love everything about this. This is why it is my favorite game of all time. I love its gameplay. And yes, if you haven't played this game, you have to. But all that aside, let's just get into what the definitive version is. So during my original playthrough a few years ago, I played the PlayStation version, but I do own the PC version too, that I'll be talking about. As this game came out originally in 1997 on Sony's PlayStation. As it was the first Final Fantasy on a non-Nintendo system. And it delivered so much. And the game had a lot of new things at the table, although it's not the definitive version, considering there's a way better version coming up. And this game was re-released about a year or two after this game came out. Square Enix was preparing a PC version of this game by Eidos, the developer of all the modern Tomb Raider games. However, that PC... No, look. I'm not talking about the Steam version, no. There was an old PC version that was so buggy and weird and clunky, it just didn't feel right. But the PlayStation version, on the other hand, was so much better, but Square Enix fixed something, because so much later, they fixed this and made an even better version I'll be talking about. And we embrace, you have to play this on every generation of PlayStation. Because even though this is a PlayStation 1 game, the game's playable on the PS2 with backwards compatibility, and on the PS3, the disc works, or you can buy digital at the PlayStation Store, same with the PSP and PS Vita, you can buy them digitally off there. However, this game's also available on current-gen consoles and on phones. The mobile version, too, though, is not the definitive version. But and there's a mobile version, too, based on the PC and consoles, but we're going to talk about those versions coming up next. And yeah, you saw it coming, guys, but in 2013, a re-release of the PC version, a proper version of it that added upgraded, enhanced graphics, added upscaled and upgraded enhanced graphics, added character boosters, added a high-speed mode, added so much new version table. That is the definitive version. Yeah. However, in 2015, a port of the PC version, I believe, also came to mobile or something, but it's not the definitive version since It runs better on PC, PS4, Xbox One, Switch. We'll talk about those. But the PS4 version also came out in 2015. Oh boy, is that the definitive way to play it. It looks so much better. Like, so much better. I'm looking at the graphics that you saw in the original PlayStation version a few minutes ago, and now look at this version. It looks so freaking good. I mean, seriously. And in 2019, Square Enix also had a brilliant idea too. They also ported Final Fantasy VII, the PC version, to the Windows Store and ported to Xbox One. If you have Game Pass, guess what? You can play that game on there, whether it's on Xbox One or PC. Isn't that amazing? And I'll talk about 7 Remake during part, and now I'll talk about 7 Remake in part 3, but very briefly, considering that 15's only, considering that 7 Remake's only available on PS4 at the moment. But and that's actually a completely different game. So play both the original Final Fantasy VII and the 7 Remake. They're actually completely different games. But and 7 Remake's more of a reboot and retelling of 7. But anyway, all that aside, if you want to play this game on the go, when you want it knows your best option, you can buy this game on the Switch. It runs very well too on the Switch. So play that version too if you want to play on the go. And yeah. And that, guys, is Final Fantasy VII. Let's move on to Final Fantasy VIII. I actually just beat this one. So just like Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII also released exclusively on the PlayStation originally, and it also had a buggy PC version about a year or so later. That was later fixed twice. But anyway, Final Fantasy VII. Not 7, but Final Fantasy VIII. It's not as good as 7, but still my favorites in the series, and still a really amazing game. And definitely play it if you haven't already. But anyway, Final Fantasy VIII came out on the PlayStation back in 1999, 2 years after Final Fantasy VII was out. And it did a lot of great stuff. And just like 7, you could also play it on every generation of PlayStation. Because you can play the original PlayStation game on the PlayStation, obviously. It's also playable on the PS2 with backwards compatibility. Same on the PS3, and you can buy digitally off there. Same on the PSP, you can buy digitally off there. Same on the PS Vita, you can also buy it digitally off there. And on the PlayStation 4, well, we'll talk about the Final Fantasy VIII Remastered as well. And yeah, in just a second. So the same year as Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII also got re-released on PC. Same year 7 got re-released on PC on Steam. The second PC version was out, and it's okay, I guess. I mean, there's nothing really anything new. It's mostly just a PlayStation version with very minor changes. They didn't even remaster the graphics like they did with 7. And yeah. And pretty minor changes. And this game also hasn't been re-released as much up until now, when you can play it on Xbox One, on PlayStation 4, and on the Switch. Let's talk about that. And next up, we're on to Final Fantasy VIII Remastered. And this is the definitive way to play Final Fantasy VIII. So you guys know by now that to play either the SNES, PlayStation, or Game Boy Advance version, but I might say SNES or Game Boy Advance version of 6, the Advance version of 5, the remaster, then the PS4, Xbox One, PC, and Switch versions of 7. But Final Fantasy VIII came out back last year in September 2019. For the 20th anniversary of the game being released in North America on PlayStation 4, on Xbox One, on the Switch, and delivered the goods. I mean, look at the graphics. They look so much better than the original Steam version. The Steam version wasn't really a lot if you own the original PlayStation release. But the remaster? is way better. The character models and graphics were highly improved. It looks so much better. And if you're having a hard time with the game, especially during the fight against Griever, that was very hard for me. And the music final battle was very hard for me yesterday or and this morning when I beat it. Well, it's also a mode that makes it easier where characters don't die as often, and yeah, that's pretty good. As that new option is option turn off encounters. I believe it's like in the 7 re-release. In the 9 release, you'll see next. Even though I've actually moved, I moved Final Fantasy IX to Part 2, so stay tuned for Part 2 if you want to see Final Fantasy IX. But anyway, it also has the feature that it was like a high speed mode too. It's way better. It has new character and has new stuff. I say this is a definitive version. It's worth the go. It's worth the money. Play this version. If you're gonna play Final Fantasy VIII, I played the Steam version. It's the definitive way. But anyway, guys, wraps up though for this video. Let me know in the comments if you've played any of these 4 games or haven't done so yet. Let me know if you want to or so. And comment about your thoughts on this video. Remember to like and comment and subscribe on this video. And subscribe if you haven't already for using the channel. So I need some subscribers. And that's it though for this video. I'll see you guys next time in part 3 for Final Fantasy 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15, as well as 7 Remake 10, 2, and 13 Tooling Returns. And I will see you guys next time. Agent S out.